Alright, okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum everyone. Apa khabar? InsyaAllah mudah-mudahan semua pelajar-pelajar berada dalam keadaan baik. Hope all of you in a very good condition. Mudah-mudahan semua urusan kita dipermudahkan oleh Allah Subhanahu Wa Taala. So Alhamdulillah, I think that this time around, so what we're going to talk about is something related to the test and examination. And of course, yes, when we talk about test and examination, there are always a questions whether we want to assess their root of learning or we want to assess their thinking skill. So perkara ini selalu menjadi persoalan kepada semua pembangun-pembangun test, sama ada kita nak menghasilkan pelajar-pelajar yang mampu berfikir ataupun hanya pelajar-pelajar yang mampu menghafal dan kemudiannya memuntahkan kembali apa yang mereka pelajari kepada kita. Jadi melihat kepada perkara tersebut, so what I can say here is there are lots of issue on testing. Of course, yes. Whether you believe or not, there are always an issue doing a testing, especially when we talk about the testing of test and examination. So normally there are a few issue. There are the three main highlight when we talk about the issue, something related to the testing setting. So how we conduct the testing itself. And number two, we are talking about the questions. How can we develop a very good questions? And number three, of course, when we want to conduct the test and also the questions, we need to have a very good reference, relevant reference, sufficient reference to make sure that we construct a good questions. A good question, it doesn't mean that the student can answer the questions, but a good question is really can testing the student knowledge and understanding related to the subject matter. So as we can see here, before we go ahead to talk about testing, and especially when we talk about test and examination, we need to understand the two terms when we talk about it. All right. The first one, the criterion reference base, and number two is the norm reference base. So what are the difference between norm and criterion? Because of this, both information is very important because of it gives us some insight to make sure that we can understand better about our students, the performance of the students. So if we can see here, when we talk about norm, normally we are looking on the relative distributions, or we can call as a central of tendency, or even we have the ability to spread the high, moderate, and lower achiever to make sure that we can see the atmosphere of the class. All right, so meaning that we want to see the performance of the students to understand how they are react into the testing and examination, and how can we discriminate or even how can we cluster all of these people into a several indicator. Number two is the criterion reference. So what means by the criterion? As we can recap on the previous lesson, so the criterion is normally we set a minimum performance standards, and the standard must be set as a predetermined standard. We know the standard before we conduct our teaching, learning, and assessment. Because of what? Because of we want the students to meet the learning outcome based on the standard given by the lecturers or the teachers. So how can we benefit from the criterion or the norm reference to make sure that we can help not only for the students, but also to help the teachers or lecturers or the setting of the classroom to ensure that we can facilitate and provide a very good support and engagement with the system. So there are a lot of things that we need to consider. All right, antaranya adalah to identify the variables. What are the variables that affects the performance of the students? And however, with this data, all right, so we can use to construct the table of data, the graph. We can see the relationships, and we can process the data and analyze to understand better about the students. And we also can construct the hypothesis based on the data, and will allow us to investigate what are the issue and challenges and experimenting the best technique in conducting our assessment. So, what is the definition of test and examination? Of course, yes, saya yakin semua nak tahu apakah maksud test and examination yang diamalkan oleh sistem pendidikan di negara kita. But I try to bring in a very basic terms on testing, on test and examination. Because of what? Because of we need to understand when we talk about test and examination, normally we are normally we are defining a test or examination as a set of questions or exercise evaluating knowledge and skill. That's the purpose of having test and examination. Number two, we want to understand, we want to know better the act of giving student a test to determine what they know and what they have learned. So this is very important for us to measure what have been taught. All right, what are the process have been going, and how does we look the process of giving and transmitting the informations, and a student able to what we call to understand the whole concepts of what we are teaching, and we need to test them to make sure that we can know whether the student learn or not. And the number three, when we talk about test and final examination, it must be in the forms of formal test of a person, because of we want to look their proficiency in that particular subject or skill. So that's the reason why testing and examination is always considered as a high stake assessment, because of we able to measure the cognitive domain directly, because of we can assess all the levels of cognitive domain. All right, this is very interesting because of what? Because of while we are assessing the student's cognitive ability, I love this quote, because of this quote by one professor from Harvard. All right, he mentioned here is no specific skill will get you ahead in the future, but way of thinking will. The key skill of the future is, well, not quite a skill, is an approach, is a philosophy, is a way of thinking, and it's critical you adopt it as soon as you are able. So meaning that to make sure that we can allow the students to think critically, to analytical thinking, to criticize, to be creative, we cannot just only focus on the declarative knowledge, but also to provide students with the non-declarative knowledge to make sure that we can unleash the potential of their cognitive domain. So that's the reason why we need to nurture our student with appropriate or with a good strategy on how does the student will think and how does the student will react, and at the end of the day they can regulate the knowledge based on their understanding to solve the real world problem. All right, this is our brain. Interesting. This is our brain. Because of what? Because of when we talk about in the perspective of formal education, normally we will emphasize on the curriculum. How does the teacher design the learning around student interest and making learning as a contextual? And we are also looking on the instructions. The educator led the student to learn in the team. Have peripheral learnings, and teachers structured the learning around the real problem, encouraging students. They are also learn in the setting outside the classroom and the schooling building. So meaning that the instruction may be not only happen in the classroom, but can be out of the classroom, and the student can gain the experience through the series of activities. And of course, assessment is very important, because of since all the students learn and learning, their assessment should allow them to understand their own learning style, their own preference, and the way student monitor enhance their own learning by looking at the performance time to time. So this is very important. When we talk about the learning taxonomy, focus on the cognitive domain, we need to understand the structure of our brain, because of our brain is so unique. This is the illustrations of the whole brain, meaning that the thinking models, because of what? Because if you can see here, we are normally mentioned that human brain have the potential in terms of left mode thinking process and also the right mode thinking process. However, interesting about this model, they are separated into four segment. So in which, if you can see there, they have the on the left mode they have a upper left and also lower left. Same with the right mode, they have a upper right and also the lower right. So every each segment have their own strength, have their own rules and processes to make sure that um, the brain working based on the task given by someone. So interesting because of we can see here whether that one is a logic or unlogic thinking, there are still have what we call the tendency. The brain can be at a lower mode and also the upper mode is depending on the task as I mentioned before. All right. So, what are the types of thinking skills? There are lots of thinking skills that we can find in the internet. So, one of it, or maybe there are, as I mentioned here, is there are five types of thinking skills, and I do believe that there are a lot outside there. But I think that this is the most important thinking skills that we need to nurture and also focus because of we are looking someone who have the critical thinking, the creative thinking, convergent and divergent thinking, computational thinking, and design thinking. And of course, each five have their own approach, strategy, and method on how to execute all of this thinking process. All right. So uh, every each thinking process, they come up with their own models, they have their own strategy, and we cannot mix the thinking process with another thinking process unless we understood the process happen in the situation. So amazingly, normally we are talk about the creative versus critical thinking because of these are the two elements that we always talk about it. All right. So if you refer into the 21st century learning design, the four C's, they are not only mentions about collaboration and also communication, but they are highlighted about creative and critical thinking and how does this can be integrated to make sure that the critical thinking and creative thinking can be a part of our skills to make sure that we can maximize the potentials of cognitive ability. So if you can see here, on the creative thinking, we can see these are the attributes: openness to the novelty, idea generation, intervention, imagination, reasoning by metaphor, analogy, divergent, playfulness. But in contrast, you can see the critical thinking focus on the evaluation and assessment, categorization and classification, logical and reasoning, interpretation, analysis, description, in which creative thinking and critical thinking are highly different. So, but however, in the perspective of scholar, both of these attributes can be merged together by looking at what are the similarity between both. And as I can mention here, if the individual can use the potential of creative and critical thinking, that individual have the ability on the awareness on the environment, meaning that he's sensitive with the environment, but also he use the knowledge and logic to make sure that he can address the issue. And one of the good thing here is the combinations of reasoning by metaphor and reasoning by logical can be integrated to give a better explorations, and the ability to synthesize, integration, and combine will allow students to create a new solutions, a new findings, and a new point of view to make sure that we can expand the potentials of cognitive brain. And of course, yes, when we talk about creative thinking, critical thinking, they are undergo into the complex setting because of we are not talking about the lower levels of cognitive processing, but if we are looking at the high level of cognitive processing, both of these having their own complexity in terms of measuring disability. And of course, yes, somehow abstract is important, simplification also important, but if we can merge these two together, I think that you can be a wonderful person because of you are considering not only on the quantitative reasoning but also the qualitative reasoning. So that's the reason why we have to put the belief that every humans not only focus on the one side's brain ability or potentials, but I believe that we can use both potential by looking at the situation, but we need to train our brain to be good as it is. All right. So when we talk about the critical thinking, so what are the main elements of the critical thinking? Because of we want to design a test questions, we want to design the examination questions. As I mentioned before, we are not only to measure the declarative knowledge, but also we want to measure on the non-declarative knowledge. So the critical thinking may be a part of your test setting. So I think that's something that you need to consider because of we want the student to have some kind of reflections to reflect the situations, not only read and memorize, but also to really understand the context of learning, put everything in a real world problems and let the student to express themselves. That's the reason why the student need to understand the importance of critical thinking because of the first elements of critical thinking is dispositions, meaning that the critical thinker are skeptical, open-minded, value fair-mindedness, respect evidence, reasoning, respect clarity, positions, and look at different points and will change the position when a reason lead them to do so. Meaning that there are a judgment and justification before they are making any decision making. They are really look at how can they analyze the data, how they can synthesize the data, and then they provide us a very good solution. That means by the dispositions. Number two, we are looking on the criteria. As a critical thinker, yes, you must to apply all of these criteria. What are the criteria? The criteria is critical thinkers always like to have an argument because of the argument will construct your knowledge. The argument will let you to evaluate your decision making. And the reason why is the argument will let you to find a good reasoning when you are mentioning about something. So if you have your own statement, you have your own stand, how can you make an argument? How could you put the reasoning there, and then you will able to put your point of view, and this point of view will let you to understand how can you shape the knowledge based on your understanding. So this is what the critical thinking is all about. That's the reason why, if we want to unleash the potential of critical thinking, we need to really understand what is the Bloom taxonomy is all about. Because of we need to master this Bloom taxonomy, and I think that most of you know what is Bloom taxonomy means. From the knowing and remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, there are six process can be happen to the students on gaining or seeking their knowledge, not only, as I mentioned before, uh, knowing and understanding, but also to know whether the student can apply and execute the knowledge based on the context. All right. So as you can see here, there are a list of useful verbs that you can use because of these are the quite familiar verbs that you can find in your course learning outcome or program learning outcome. And you can see here, this one is the useful verb, and the next column is the sample of question stamps. Because I do believe that when we construct our cost in an outcome is always in the form of statement, but however you also can apply this in the dialogue versions, in which you can ask, for example, if you want to assess on the tell, you can ask the students through dialogue with a question that what happened after, how many, who was it, and can you name it and whatnot. So I already listed the useful verb and stem according to uh, the cognitive taxonomy difficulty from C1 until C6. So you can see here, this one is comprehension at C2. All right, these are the list of the verbs that you can use. Same goes with the C3 applications. These are the verbs and also the sample of question stem, in which I think that you can refer into my notes. All right, and also here analysis C4. All right, the useful verbs and also the question stems, and also here C5 evaluations. These are the list of verbs and also the question stem, and the last part is create C6. All right, from the useful verb and also the question stem. So I think that you can search this more in the internet and you can get more from it. But the important part is to understand that there are a lot of verbs we can use, but the most important part, how to choose the appropriate verbs, put in our course learning outcome and translate into the test and examination. That one is very important. Okay, so with that, all right, so thank you so much. So see you for the next video. Bye bye.